So welcome everybody. Claudia is here. I think we're gonna wait 5 minutes before we actually kick things off. But do write down where you're tuning in from. It's really interesting to see in the chat where you're coming from.
Oh yeah, quite a range of places. Super
Yeah,
nice.
wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, very impressive. Very nice to see such an international group.
Mhm. Mhm.
Super nice. Really from everywhere. Singapore, amazing. Incredible.
Yeah, I kind of wish we could have done this one as like that meeting version where you can actually see everyone, but we had so many people signed up that was going to be a bit tricky, but still nice to get some feeling of who's there with us.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe I should slowly kick off with an introduction then, and then we can get into the event then, if that's all right with everyone. So, hello everybody. Welcome to this launch event. I am Claudia Schwallies, the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext. Welcome to our launch event for our new paper on spaces for deliberation. So before I hand over to our wonderful moderator and speakers, I'll just give a very short introduction to DemocracyNext and why we're interested in this topic. So DemocracyNext is an international research and action institute working to accelerate the spread of high quality, empowered, and permanent citizens' assemblies. We want to shift who has power and how we take decisions in government, as well as organizations of daily life like schools, universities, museums, cooperatives, workplaces. On the research side of things, we're doing research and creating various kinds of resources for the field to help more people in more places and organizations know what are citizens' assemblies, how do they work, what are standards of good practice. And since our mission is essentially about scaling democratic deliberation, our focus is on the various infrastructure needed to enable that, the tech, civic, legal, physical infrastructure. So the paper that we're launching today fits into that physical infrastructure part of what's needed. On the action side of our work, we're working with governments and other kinds of organizations like museums and universities, workplaces, who are wanting to push the boundaries of the field, implementing permanent assemblies and testing new innovations like tech enhancements. So we ourselves at DemNext are not a practitioner organization. We don't run assemblies ourselves, but we rather get involved as partners to run intensive capacity building programs to build up local skills within an administration and civil society so that people know how to do this themselves. And our role is to provide some advice on how to institutionalize, and connected back to the research part of our work, we also ensure that there's a robust research program and evaluation that takes place. And finally, more people knowing about these ideas, all these amazing examples, and the research is also a key to scaling. So we invest a lot in our communications and storytelling as well. So why did we want to do this work on spaces for deliberation at DemNext? Well, there are more and more places that are interested in making citizens' assemblies permanent institutions for decision-making in more places. And yet, quite often, we're still in a situation where there are no dedicated spaces for these assemblies to be taking place. So they're often being held in either city council halls or hotel or conference rooms, sometimes other public buildings like libraries, and these spaces are not always adapted for deliberation. Practitioners are typically very thoughtful and intentional about working with what they have, as James and Gustav will elaborate on in their presentation, and I'm sure all of our speakers will touch on as well. So we wanted to understand better and shine a light on the considerations for the spatial qualities that can enable deliberation. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'll now pass it over to our wonderful moderator, Vera Sacchetti, who will introduce herself and our other speakers for today.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I am delighted to be here. My name is Vera Sacchetti, and a warm welcome to everybody who joined since Claudia's introduction. Do feel free to write in the chat box where you're tuning in from. For us, it's really interesting to see who's there watching and listening to us. So I'm a curator and a critic focusing in design and architecture, and I'm very excited to be here to moderate this session because this paper is addressing a crucial lack of information that we have around ideas of design and architecture of dedicated spaces for running citizens' assemblies. My own relationship with DemNext and with issues of design and democracy dates back now a couple of years, well, more than a couple of years, I would say 5 years. And it has been very interesting to see that there is really almost no literature on this topic. So it was with a lot of excitement that I heard the news that James and Gustav were tackling this topic. And it is good news for all of us who are enthusiasts of deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies to have this resource. So I just want to say a warm thank you to DemNext for starting this investigation and for making this paper accessible. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how this event is going to happen today. We are very happy to have James and Gustav here, who will start by introducing the paper and its key findings. And then we are going to go and talk to our esteemed guests, Sarah Jaffe, Johan Gaster, and Philippe Ray, who are joining from very different parts of the globe. And all of them were interviewed for the making of this paper. So after that, we will have some questions directed to all of our guests, as well as to James and Gustav. And at the very end, we will be picking some questions from the audience from the chat box. So if you do have questions while we are running the presentation and the Q&A, please drop them there, and I'll be looking at the chat box in a bit and sort of taking as many questions as we can from the audience, really. We really appreciate your curiosity, and we are very excited to hear from James and Gustav. And I will introduce them properly. So James MacDonald-Nelson is DemocracyNext Cities Program Lead, and Gustav Kjær Vad Nielsen is a research fellow at DemNext. And together they have been working on the paper Spaces for Deliberation, 8 Spatial Qualities for Designing Deliberative Assemblies for some time now. They have been interviewing practitioners from Canada, Colombia, Belgium, Denmark, Australia, and the USA, and they have identified key spatial qualities for successful citizen deliberation. I'm not going to go through what those are because I'm going to pass the word on to James and Gustav, who will introduce their key findings and the paper that they've been working on.
Thank you so much, Vera and Claudia. And thank you so much to the panelists that are here as well today. It's really great to have you, and nice to see you again, not in person, but at least virtually. It's always nice to connect over this work. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Everything working okay there? All right. So yeah, as I said, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to see so many people interested in this topic from many different corners of the earth. It's really great to see such a turnout for this. So as you know, we'll be discussing this new paper that Gustav and I have been working on together called Spaces for Deliberation, 8 Spatial Qualities for Designing Deliberative Assemblies. So in the spirit of being both a research and action institute, we often work together with research fellows like Gustav to explore specific topics within deliberative democracy, but sometimes also how this intersects with other fields of study, such as spatial practice in this case. So as Gustav and I both come from a background in architecture, some of the questions we have grappled with around citizens' assemblies are really centered on those spatial aspects of deliberation. There we go. So we found that really the discourse in deliberative democracy rightfully tends to focus on the design of the process rather than the specific spaces where assemblies tend to take place. But through our conversations with practitioners, so facilitators and organizers of assemblies, we know that a lot of thought and consideration goes into the spatial organization and functionality of the spaces that host citizen deliberation. So what we're interested in is shining a light on this element and really diving into the topic further, because as we argue in the paper, the spatial qualities for citizen deliberation demand more critical attention. So to do this, we spoke with 7 practitioners and researchers from 6 different countries. And with them, we discussed with them the spatial qualities they often consider, the challenges they encounter, and the opportunities and limitations for a more intentional spatial design. So from these conversations, we landed on a few key findings. So, as I said, the spatial qualities of citizens' assemblies are often carefully considered by these conveners when planning and designing the processes. But in some cases, the practical requirements that go into running a citizens' assembly are often prioritized over the considerations for qualities such as atmosphere or symbolic value when both can't really be achieved. And this results in, a set of common challenges to choosing spaces with the kind of suitable spatial qualities for deliberative assemblies, such as the high cost of renting spaces or the cost of temporary adaptations, inaccessible locations, or just general availability. But it's important to note that the scope of this paper is also limited and requires further research. So of the hundreds of practitioners worldwide, we only spoke to 7 and we limited our investigation to 6 countries. But we're really interested to learn more from practitioners and to learn also maybe from the audience today as well about work that they do in this space as well. So at the end of this presentation, we'll outline some further avenues that we're thinking about for exploration. And we really welcome feedback as we're aware that there's and a likelihood of an even greater diversity of considerations to look at. But first, I'm going to pass over to Gustav to go through some of the existing literature on this topic.
Thank you, James. So our intention has really been to introduce the spatial thinking a little bit more into the field of deliberative democracy and specifically into the practice of deliberative assemblies. And some literature does exist already that looks into the relationships between spaces and institutional democracy. So one study that we sort of take a starting point from has been the work by the Dutch architecture studio XML on the design and the architecture of parliament buildings around the world, which really shows how uniform parliament design has been historically and still today is, and how it adheres to certain design principles and ways of organizing space, revolving around formations like the semicircle, the circular seating, the opposed benches, the horseshoe, and then we've sort of tried to look a little bit further into literature that has come before that as well. So work that has been done on parliament buildings in different parts of the world, additional institutional architecture of democracy that really focus on not only institutional spaces but also representative democracy. We've also looked a bit more into some of the literature that looks a little bit broader at the relationship between architecture, urban spaces, and democratic politics and democratic culture. Still with a focus on how spatial considerations have found its way into political science, but also some of the attempts by architects and collaborations between architectural scholars and political science scholars to find synergies between, for example, democratic theorizing, political theory, and architectural practices and architectural theory. Someone like John Parkinson, coming from political science and trying to really understand how urban spaces, public spaces, are contributing to democratic cultures, and then also back to urban scholars who really look at the implications of urban form in enabling or restricting certain forms of democratic culture and democratic practice. And what we found in this literature is the absence of deliberative assemblies, especially these dedicated spaces that we're talking about. But we really sort of also want to bring our specific investigation into this much more broader field of space and how architectural design and urban design works in terms of enabling democratic culture also beyond the citizens' assembly. So as we already mentioned, the citizens' assemblies are becoming more commonplace around the world, and for us, this is then really an opportunity to contribute with a specific sort of look into how we design these spaces that citizens' assemblies take place in, and this is what we've started to do here in our paper. So I'll hand it back to James, I think.
Thanks, Gustav. So yeah, so to do this, we knew it was really important to meet with the people who are really at the forefront of this work. So the practitioners and researchers delivering and studying citizens' assemblies. So with over 700 assemblies having taken place around the world, there are really many examples of physical spaces that have been adapted and used to host deliberative processes. So as Claudia mentioned in the beginning, this really tends to range from a whole host of different kinds of spaces, such as legislative spaces in parliaments, conference centers, schools, universities, community centers, city halls, amongst others. And from the conversations we had with the practitioners in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, and the US, we had an opportunity to better understand the kinds of physical conditions that these assemblies take place in today. So I'll go through just briefly some of the key points from the conversations that we had with these practitioners. So in Belgium, we spoke to Anna Edzerson, who was a facilitator with Agora, which was a Belgian political party. They ran on a platform of using assemblies to inform its policy positions in parliament. So these assemblies were taking place both in the regional parliament chambers and an historic building within Brussels. But what Anna highlighted is that the parliament chamber had its advantages, it lent a significance and kind of a legitimacy to the process, but then often lacked the flexibility for adapting the space for deliberation. Whereas the historic building, which was more sort of politically neutral, so to say, and was conducive for sort of diverse participants to feel welcome, but it was difficult to control lighting conditions, acoustics, and kind of lack that quiet space needed for small breakout groups. Speaking with Kimber White, who's a co-founder of the facilitation organization Mosaic Lab in Australia, we learned about the typical spaces in which they organize assemblies. So since spatial flexibility is really a central consideration to their work, they tend to select locations that can be reimagined or rearranged throughout the deliberation process. They emphasize that they do not use tables in their assemblies and only provide chairs for members to deliberate together in small circles, so, as you can see here in this picture. But other qualities Kimber mentioned that are really important for them are good natural light, access to outdoor space, and a venue that maybe has relevance to the subject matter itself. But the challenge is really finding locations with all of those characteristics in one place. So it means that they often have to compromise and use conference centers or hotels that lack that sense of place, and feel disconnected from the assembly process, but allow for that flexibility, for example. In Canada, we spoke with Sarah, who's here with us today. She's the director at Mass LVP in Toronto. And Sarah discussed the timing of assemblies, for example, and that often in Canada, they're scheduled during the autumn, winter, or spring to avoid summer holidays. But harsh winter conditions, which tend to go into the autumn and the spring, also necessitate indoor locations with a lot of flexibility as well. So Sarah, in our discussion, also emphasized that flexibility as being an important consideration, plenty of natural light as well, and again, also sufficient breakout space for small group discussions. In Belgium, or back to Belgium, but in this German-speaking region of Belgium, there is a permanent ongoing citizens' assembly where deliberations take place in two locations. So one is in the regional parliament, as you can see on the left here, in Eupen, and it also in their cultural center, in a cultural center in the south of the region in St. Vith. So we spoke to Miriam Peltzer, who until recently headed the public relations department in the German-speaking parliament, and she pointed out a couple of things. So the parliament is used and the plenary sessions are taking place in this legislative space with fixed desks in a semicircle. And small breakout groups are then organized in kind of oversized conference spaces. But in both spaces, the acoustic quality tends to be quite good. So there's a trade-off there in wanting the space to accommodate good acoustics so people can have conversations and they can hear each other well, but then they're often using spaces that are typically used for a more representative democracy process. Whereas in the cultural center, for example, there's more flexibility with open space and movable furniture, and there's kind of that ability to arrange or rearrange tables based on the session's needs. Finally, we also spoke to Felipe in Colombia, who's also here with us today, who has coordinated some of the first deliberations in Latin America using random selection of citizens. And the example he shared with us took place in the Department of Medicine at the National University of Colombia. So in this case, the advantages was that it was taking place in a learning environment that is, a public space, is impressive and aspirational in some ways. They were able to use classrooms in the auditorium and outdoor green spaces, and it also allowed for flexibility. But there was a disconnect between, the space itself having a connection with the topic of the assembly, and felt slightly placeless in that sense too. In Denmark, we met with Johan Galster, who's also here with us today. And he really emphasized some of the atmospheric requirements that they consider for assemblies. So thinking about creating a space that is both comfortable and cozy, but also still conveying that sense of importance to the process. So having bright and inviting spaces designed for people is a really important part of their work. And at their headquarters in Copenhagen, they've actually created a space that they translated into English anyways, is called the People's Living Room, where assemblies sometimes also take place. So this space includes round tables, movable furniture, careful acoustic and lighting design, and this helps to kind of convey that sense of coziness as well as a professional attitude in the space itself. And then finally, we spoke to Dimitra Dimitropoulou, who is the head of translational research and practice at the MIT Center for Constructive Communication, where they've organized 2 student assemblies in the last couple of years. So a key part of organizing these assemblies has been to experiment with technology, so microphones and recording devices, to record the assemblies and the assembly deliberations in order to analyze those deliberations with AI. So this is done for a couple of reasons. One is to amplify sort of overlooked voices, but also surfacing insights in real time from the assembly, but also to visualize dialogue and help assembly members understand how their ideas evolved over the course of the assembly itself. But because introducing such recording technology into an assembly may make some members feel uncomfortable or bring up questions about how the data will be used, Dimitra's team approached the design of the assembly space to help really foster that sense of trust and transparency by meeting with the researcher who will be using that data, for example. So you can see that in the picture in the bottom left here. The selection of microphones was carefully sort of designed as a process and were individualized as well, so people felt kind of a closer connection. And then you can see a small schema there for how they designed the space, how people would enter the room, access this data bar, choose their microphone, and then formally enter the assembly space itself. So really drawing upon the learnings from these cases, we've identified a list of 8 spatial considerations for citizens' assemblies. So I'm going to pass it back over to Gustav to discuss the first 4.
Yeah, so we've come to these eight qualities that we've sort of synthesized from our conversations, and we will go through them really quickly, but they're really sort of quite a bit more elaborate in the paper itself. These qualities are meant as a preliminary set of ideas and really based on the conversations with the practitioners of what is already being considered today, and then in relation to some of the sort of ideals of the deliberative process itself. So the first one that we found was really to do with light. And all the qualities here are going to be they're going to be very, very foundational ideas about what the space contributes, and it's less so about a scripting of the space, more so about certain preconditions and how we can think with them to set up these spaces in different ways. So in terms of the light, we really found that poor lighting was a big challenge. But both in terms of natural light and also in terms of having artificial lighting that could be adjusted throughout a deliberative session. So really thinking with both a combination of natural and artificial lighting, and also thinking with different ways that these can be adjusted, not only by the facilitators but also by members who are in the assembly. So you really can make sure that there is the comfort and the required light for seeing the different things that you're doing in the assembly. A second quality that we talked quite a bit about was the acoustics. And I can see that Deborah already brought this up in the chat, that there is a whole range of different needs in terms of acoustics. And again, this really means that it has to be adjustable. But there's also so much that technical equipment can do, and really the architecture and the spaces themselves can provide a lot of this already if they are more carefully thought into the design. So we discussed and are proposing some ideas for doing this here with the use of specific types of materials that are providing a good acoustics. It can be perforated materials, it could be softer wooden, textile materials that can be used to control the acoustics. But then as well, you can use a number of different technical equipments to make sure that everybody can hear, and also so that people can have conversations in more private ways. So we talked briefly about also how additional spaces are helpful in this regard. But this is also a conversation we're having in another one of our spatial qualities. So if we go to the next one, specifically this idea that there's a need for additional spaces to sort of more like one of the main spaces that you use in the deliberative sessions for various purposes, not only for breakout groups, but also for breaks between sessions, for casual conversations, for additional activities, and the fact that these spaces should really be in close proximity to each other. So there is a flexibility, but also opportunities for sort of moving between these spaces quite easily during a process. The fourth quality that I'll briefly mention here has to do with the culturally and socially anchored place of these spaces, and this is really a point that we're hoping to elaborate further on in future research. But on one hand, the importance of having symbolic anchors that really could be, on one hand, instill a certain sense of importance to a process like this. So this is sometimes the reason why certain sessions take place in existing political institutions, in parliament spaces, chambers, to really instill this sense of importance. But on the other hand, it's also incredibly important to anchor that process and these spaces in closer to the everyday lives of the citizens that are taking part in them. So often this will be a trade-off, and we describe that further in the paper, how sometimes there might be some functionality requirements that are pushing against choosing certain spaces that have a great location or a great let's say it could be a historic value and character where maybe a large number of the members are used to coming. So this is like a sort of a trade-off, but something really to think about. And we briefly mentioned that something like co-creating these spaces could even be a way to think with this spatial quality. I think I'll hand it over to you, James, because I could keep talking about this one especially, but I think
Sounds good.
favor.
All right. So the fifth sort of element we talk about here is the accessible location and the navigation of the space. So in our schema here, we're showing really the accessibility of the physical space itself or the assembly. Excuse me, but it can also really refer to the accessibility of the space in a the scale of a city or the scale of a region, for example. So depending on at what level of governance the assembly itself is taking place, and how many people from various different places need to access that space, choosing a place that is also accessible to most people and they can reach it quite easily, either through public transportation or other means, is really important. Just as it is important to imagine the accessibility of the space itself, so that any member of the assembly can move throughout the space without any barriers, for example. The sixth consideration we talked about is creating kind of a formal and welcoming atmosphere. So this ties a lot to what also Johan was talking about with the people's living room in Copenhagen. But really considering how material choices and things like decorative items play a role in creating that atmosphere that is, on the one hand, lends a sense of importance to the process, but is also welcoming for the various activities that happen throughout the assembly. So designing a space for that kind of diversity of sensorial and emotional experiences allows for both casual and relaxed conversations during some parts of the process and serious work of drafting and voting on recommendations on the other hand. The seventh consideration relates to the flexibility of furniture and equipment during the process. So whether it can be placed or rearranged in the space to ensure that space then remains flexible and adaptable depending on the specific activities of the assembly process. So holding an assembly in a place where furniture is fixed or immovable, might present, like in the case of Belgium, good acoustic qualities, but it presents a challenge for the organizers and also the assembly members who are not necessarily sitting together, but rather sitting in that kind of horseshoe, very typical sort of a democracy space or legislative space. And then the final consideration has to do with the thoughtful integration of technologies. So as we mentioned at MIT, where they've been experimenting with student assemblies, there has been this question around how we thoughtfully integrate the use of technology in the process and create a space, a physical space before entering into the assembly space itself to encounter that technology, to hear how it's going to be used, how your data is going to be used, to perhaps also meet with the researcher who might be using that data, for example. So there's really like a spatial consideration for how we carefully integrate that if we're going to use it in an assembly process. So creating something that is visible and approachable and easier to engage with is something that will help assembly members understand it in a different way. So we're just getting to the end of our presentation here, so I'll pass it right back over to Gustav to discuss the kind of next steps and things we're thinking about as we finish this first paper and carry on with our explorations in this space.
Yeah, so I can see that there's already a question in the Q&A regarding what we left out in this paper, and we did leave out quite a bit of things, but we limited the scope to really thinking with how are these spatial considerations thought about today, and some of the future steps that we would like to take and also see others engage with with regards to citizens' assembly specifically have, for example, a lot to do with how spatial design could address something like internal exclusion. So when you're in the assembly and you're formally included, but still could feel excluded in various ways and for various reasons, and how the spatial design could potentially address this and might even contribute to something like that. As well as disagreements and how those are, in a sense, mediated also by the spatial qualities in the assemblies. Then we would be curious to look further into something like the integration of advanced technologies and how these might change the spatial considerations. I can jump right back maybe to number 5 in the list here on the screen, that something like how are physical spaces working together with virtual spaces. Is that something we left out in this paper, but something that really needs a lot of further research to try and understand how those relationships play out. And this relates back to the technologies as well, that both can be helpful in the physical and the virtual spaces. Then we are really interested in thinking with the anchoring of deliberative spaces in place-based social and cultural practices through something like co-design and co-creation. Also thinking with existing spaces and how they might be adapted. So it's not necessarily a question of creating new spaces from scratch, but really thinking with what is there, both socially and physically already, and how we can work from there. And this relates to the fourth point, that we really want to think with how these spaces can contribute a sort of almost a positive impact on climate and biodiversity. Really think with adaptive reuse practices from architecture and urban design, and how we can adapt and create spaces for caring about also climate and biodiversity in the citizens' assemblies. So I think this is all we had for our paper presentation, right, James?
Yes, yeah, this is great. Thank you, Gustav, as well. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm happy now to turn it over to Vera as we start the discussion as well. And I'm excited to get to some of these questions. I just had a chance to review some of them as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James and Gustav. Really incredible stuff. I want to shift the conversation to invite some feedback from our guests, and I wanted to go right ahead and talk to Johan Gasser from We Do Democracy. He's tuning in from Denmark. We already heard a lot about the feedback that he gave towards the making of the paper. Johan, how does this final version of the paper resonate with what you with your experience, with what you have been doing? I mean, one thing that was really striking to me when I read the paper was this focus on coziness, so really an atmospheric quality, but totally vital for the good functioning and for this feeling of comfort and willingness to participate. So can you tell us a bit about how the paper has resonated with you, and which, if any, of the key findings seem like more interesting to you?
Sure, I will do that. And first of all, congratulations with the report and the findings, and sharing it with all of us. So thank you for doing that. And just to shortly introduce, we have been running about 25 citizen assemblies in Denmark and in Norway and in the Scandinavia region. And there's a lot of stuff in this report and these findings that, of course, resonates. But we have to kind of, from the first thing, why are we doing these citizen assemblies? So it's when we are doing the civic lottery, that is to bring citizens from all over the society into one room. Citizens have never participated before in these processes. So we have to make a room where you can actually feel, oh, I can actually be in this room. I'm not kind of, I'm comfortable with being here. It's not that powerful room so that I have to kind of have a PhD in some things to actually be a part of this room. So as a facilitator and designer of this process, it's very important to have a focus on this, as you mentioned in the question. I will say in Danish, we'll say the balance between power and hygge. The coziness, the feeling that it's acceptable actually to be just one like me in this room. And that is, and you can design this in many ways as a facilitator. Often we have this democracy garage in Copenhagen, and it's a place where it's possible for everyone to be a part of it, and we can have run the citizen assembly in a way where you feel comfortable about the settings, the atmosphere there. But you can also design it. Very often, we actually design it in the beginning of the citizen assembly at the classic, city hall building, with the formal room, with the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen, making you empowered as a member of this citizen assembly, that this is actually a system who will take this work that you're doing very serious, and we are kind of looking forward for the recommendation for all the things you're doing. So some, it's a practical. In the beginning, you need some of the power from the spaces with the formal power to actually embrace and empower you as a citizen to be a member of this citizen assembly, saying this is actually a serious thing that the system and the politician will take in count when you're done with with your work, and then bring the members and the rest of the meeting in the citizen assembly into an informal meeting place, a place where you actually can kind of be active, learning, have fun, have reflections together, be safe, be secure, that it's okay to have another opinion and another meaning that my neighbor or someone else from the city. And then in the end of the process, going back to the city hall, bringing the recommendation back to the system, the Lord Mayor, or who is actually kind of the commissioning part of this citizen assembly. So it's not that one space kind of makes it all. You can also shift between the spaces and make this balance between the formal and the informal, meeting the power of the place or the more kind of in Danish hygge place, where you can actually feel that it's okay to be a part of this process, just an ordinary Copenhagener or wherever you are from.
Thank you so much, Johan. I mean, I love the fact that you bring the hygge into the conversation. I think it's always a great term to bring in any discussion.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. No, it's great. I'm gonna pass to Felipe Rey, who is joining us from Colombia, from Bogota. And he, as James and Gustav said, he's the founder of IDEMOS, and he's been designing citizens' assemblies, namely itinerant citizens' assemblies in Bogota. And in the paper, there's a little bit about how you discuss this idea that organizing assemblies in spaces such as university spaces, like you've done, is very aspirational for the people that understand that take part in the experience. But at the same time, they understand their mission perhaps as something very important by the qualities of the space that are already there. But at the same time, this is a space that allows for a lot of flexibility. So you can rearrange furniture, have different configurations of spaces. This idea of transition, of permanent transition and agility, is something that permeates the paper throughout. So can you give us a bit of a comment on your feedback on the key findings, and how does this resonate with the work that you've been doing?
Sure, thank you very much, Barry, and thank you to DemocracyNext for this invitation. Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I think that this report, like any really great piece of writing, is opening up a complete new ground in the field. So I think that this is new terrain, and I want to congratulate James and Gustav for this. It's a new field because it makes us think about less spaces for power and more spaces for service in our democracy. So it makes us think, what if political spaces were places where people go to serve democracy, not dominate democracy, which is different. And it's also very path-breaking because it isn't just about citizens' assemblies. It's a broader political reflection. Because, Vera, if we take seriously the question of how citizen deliberation should be designed, as we are doing, we are also taking deeper questions about how all our political spaces are designed: parliaments, government buildings, even courts. That's why it is very, very important. Well, I think that yes, for example, we have done deliberations in universities. I think that this is important. But I also think that this is it's a ground where we have to raise our standards. I am actually for raising our standards, and I will try to make an argument about why it is important to really worry about better spaces for citizens' assemblies. You know that one question we keep circling back in the field is, are citizens' assemblies mostly about participation or are they about representation? So the question here is, when people take part in an assembly, are they just speaking for themselves, or are they, in some cases, as I think they are doing, they are speaking on behalf of others? Because if they are speaking on behalf of others, if these assemblies are at times speaking in the name of the public, that really, I think, changes how we think about this space, because we are not longer designing spaces for internal dialogue. We are designing for what we could call representative deliberation, a kind of deliberation that is done in the name of the people. And that raises very all sorts of interesting design questions. For example, what does it mean to create spaces where people are not only deliberating among themselves, but also communicating with the broader public? So this is a matter about visibility. Do we need, and I think we have to be sincere with this, do we need more formal elements like podiums, microphones, even cameras to support that public-facing role? Another important question, how do we distinguish between spaces for private deliberation where people need to be quiet, to focus and to trust, and spaces for public deliberation where the goal is visibility and connection? And the final question I'd like to raise is, what happens beyond deliberation itself? Can we think about, for example, places for recruitment? Can we think about, and I think this is very important, about places for communication between citizens' assemblies and decision makers and politicians? You know, always we have this idea of a report that someone gives to a mayor or a president or so on. Why don't we think spatially also in places where politicians have to go actually to meet the members of citizens' assemblies? I am really for all these reforms. Thank you, Vera.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And this is really, kind of a call for the creation of spaces at large. And this is also a question that Gustav and James have raised. We should think bigger than just spaces for deliberation, right? And what you're talking about are spaces for encounter, but many of your considerations are very, very interesting. And I think James and Gustav might have something to say about that afterwards. But I do want to go ahead and talk to Sarah Yaffa, who's joining us from Toronto, Canada, where she's a director at Mass LBP, and she's been overseeing deliberative and strategic initiatives there. Sarah, when I read your contribution in the paper, I was really struck by this aspect that James was talking about, this idea of the harsh winters in Canada and the seasonal aspect of these assemblies. But right now, I don't want to just ask you about that. I do want to ask you about how the paper's key findings have resonated with you. But I also want to ask if you were having any thoughts as to what Johan and Felipe have been contributing to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Vera, and thanks for the invitation. I mean, to be honest, when I read the paper, all I wanted was some freshly baked bread. And I'm sure others felt the same way. But I think that piece of it, that piece of feeling comfortable and welcome, is one of the pieces that really resonates with me. And with the work that we do at Mass. And so, the finding a space and creating a space that feels welcoming to everyone is such an important piece of the puzzle. And of course, when you're bringing together a very diverse group of people, what is welcoming to one may not be welcoming to others. So we have to be really cautious and considerate around those pieces. It's one of in the work that we do, we are always grounded in the truth and reconciliation work that is a big part of Canadian culture with our Indigenous peoples. And, there is an inherent distrust of colonial institutions, which is absolutely legitimate, that we have to work with. So in terms of building legitimacy, the question of legitimacy for whom? And that is a challenging piece because we certainly want the recommendations of our processes to be taken up by policymakers who are generally part of those colonial systems. But we want to be welcoming to all of the residents, the people we engage who may have very different feelings about those systems. I also just wanted to pick up on one piece that I saw in the chat around gender and being really cautious and thoughtful to be responsive to needs. And so, yes, we always do insist that we have additional spaces, and they're not necessarily for breakout sessions. They're for people to pray, to nurse, to have a FaceTime call with their kids if we're having long days. So, the requirements, the needs of the people that we're bringing together are sort of paramount for us, both in the space and in how we welcome them throughout the process. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think that I really want to go back to James and Gustav because Johan, Felipe, and Sarah all raised interesting points that you might have thoughts about. So I just would love to hear from you now about those.
Thank you, Vera. Yeah, maybe is it okay to go first, Gustav? Some things that kind of hit me as well. I think, reflecting a bit on what you bring up, Johan, around this idea of it not needing to necessarily be one space that is, serving all the functions necessarily, and that there can be this kind of back and forth between the spaces that serve for a citizens' assembly, and both have kind of that that function of allowing people to feel comfortable to deliberate and feel sort of welcome, and that they don't need to be in the city hall necessarily, but they feel connected a bit more to their community, for example. But then when delivering those recommendations, creating an opportunity for them to go to those legislative spaces and feel the kind of importance. But I think that's interesting too to connect it to what Felipe was talking about, where we can think even beyond the traditional spaces of deliberation, where it's either a space where there is maybe more of a community feel versus something that has a bit more of an official feel, but creating those new spaces actually where politicians might actually have to come and hear the recommendations. And it's not where the deliberations happen. It's not in the legislative space, but it's kind of a different space that could host that. It's kind of part of the considerations we're thinking of in future iterations of this paper, or future parts of this paper, I guess, around how would we maybe adapt existing buildings or think of our sort of civic infrastructure that we already build as a society as well, thinking about libraries or community centers, and designing those with a more intentionality to be able to host assemblies or host the space where citizens deliver their recommendations, for example, but really then creating, like from the beginning, design spaces that allow and accommodate for deliberation process. So Matt, I don't know, maybe I'll pass it over to Gustav. I'll leave it there for now, but lots of great points. Thank you, the three of you, for adding.
Yeah, I think some really good points are being raised, and I think also in the chat. Maybe a starting point for me would be to think with Felipe about the sort of extended ecology of spaces that deliberative democracy is, and our societies and democratic culture more broadly. And yes, we can think with the design of these various steps in the deliberative assembly. While we can also think with how spaces are used for a range of different activities, and I think in the way that we have approached this study, we've tried to be specific, and so we're leaving out. There's quite a lot of literature. I can already see people bringing up literature on spaces for contestation and conflict. Other types of communicating. So when we think about deliberation, how do we think of deliberation versus dialogue and debate, and the specificity of some of these terms, and what some people in democratic theorizing talk about as the productive concept stretching. sometimes, like the sort of balance between those ideas, and then in a spatial sense to think beyond the deliberative assembly itself is, I think, a very productive space to be. So that was a bit convoluted, but I'm trying to address maybe some wider conversations that are happening in democratic sort of practice and theory, um, and how we might actually be able to think through some of this. Specifically, I'm thinking about the notion of concept stretching and the productivity of stretching concepts like deliberation, or to what point that might be unproductive, and how we might address that through more careful spatial analysis and spatial understanding of these processes. I think this is what comes to mind first with Felipe's point, and to Sarah's, in terms of legitimacy and who we build legitimate institutions for, is incredibly important. And I hope that the list of qualities that we're talking about in the paper, on one hand, come across as specific, but also come across as things that play a role in building uh, legitimate experiences. And depending on how we use those spatial elements, we can be building legitimacy for different people, and more than human agencies, etc. as well. So um, I feel like we're addressing some of these questions in the paper, and yeah, I think I'll stop there for now. There's so many more important things coming out in the chat as well, I can see. So
I mean, we always knew that we were not going to have time to answer every single point that has been raised. We're just opening a discussion here and launching a lot of questions. I mean, as you said yourselves, this is just the beginning. And this is a point that has been reinforced multiple times today. And I think it's a point that we should really take in consideration. There is a lot of enthusiasm for this, and the work will continue. I do want to go towards a very specific question, because now I was really loving this point that Felipe started and Gustav was now talking about, this idea that, we're not just talking about specifically spaces for deliberation, we're also talking about spaces for coming together, spaces for encounters, wider consideration about how is it that we can have notions of how to create spaces in a better way. But I want to go back and be like extremely specific, because as a design curator, there's a point that has been on my mind since the beginning of the presentation, which is, what about the furniture? So, you talked about, how things have to be stackable, adaptable, and so on and so forth. But I mean, we can really think about comfortable chairs for once. We know that in citizens assemblies, normally we're using all these IKEA clap down chairs and so on and so forth. These are not the best for like 10-hour days of deliberation together, right? We all know that. And so I'm wondering, I mean, I'm not proposing here to start like a cooperation with a furniture manufacturer to develop specific furniture, but I do think that we have to understand that there's of course a lot of restrictions. Sometimes, we are using spaces that have been lent to us or rented for a day or two, but maybe there are best practices. We can think about accessibility the same way that we design furniture, for example, for inclusion, for people that have maybe difficulties in mobility or something. We could maybe also think about being extremely specific about how is it that we need to design these elements for deliberation. Same with the inclusion of technology. There's a huge point that you started with the paper. And of course, you also launched it now at the end, the idea of, bridging the gap between virtual and physical. This is, of course, something that, expands on this idea of having technology well integrated inside the spaces for deliberation. But how do we bridge that gap? And maybe I just want to invite a little bit of a comment on those two topics. And then I'm going to get to questions from the audience.
Thanks, Vera. Yeah, I really love the idea of like diving into the very one-to-one scale of thinking of like the furniture design. It's something we did talk about actually while we were kind of brainstorming early on in this paper, and then exploring different ideas of what kind of furniture elements, really material, like at the material level and the design level, could or would be better in an assembly process, and what kind of mixture of furniture could you also have? Of course, maybe you need the sort of harder chairs that are comfortable, but keep you maybe awake, versus maybe during some moments you have couches, or you have something that people can feel a little bit more comfortable in. It gives them that kind of break from that formality of just sitting on a chair all the time. But there's also even the consideration we had from hearing from the practitioners in Australia, who are really adamant about having no table facilitation, for example, and that they only focus on using chairs, which is different than how it's normally done here in Europe and North America, I believe, as well, where they only use chairs in those deliberations. And as you saw in the picture, they also sit quite closely, actually, too. So there's a consideration there, too, around how that kind of creates a level of intimacy in the process. And it creates a way of breaking down kind of a boundary or a barrier between people as they explore a topic. Maybe it prohibits them from taking notes very, very well, like they would on a table, for example, but it maybe allows them also to engage in the conversation and topic in a more present way as well. So I totally hear you on wanting to go a little bit deeper into the really the design element of that furniture. And if we were to actually create a space that was predominantly used for citizens' assemblies amongst other sort of civic activities, you could have then a furniture that is built for that space and is used specifically for deliberative processes themselves. So it'd be kind of fun to work with facilitators and designers to kind of come up with a line of furniture or whatnot that could be tested and experimented in such a way as well. I don't know, Gustav, if you wanted to come in on that too.
Maybe just very brief this time. I think it's a really important scale to address, and really touches on the embodiment and the material haptic experience and encounters with deliberation. As a designer myself, I also am deeply sort of engaged with thinking through specific design proposals, but I also think I would be apprehensive in terms of turning it into a furniture design exercise. But I do of course get where you're coming from, Vera, with the question, and I also think there's a lot of work and literature and practices that we are not referencing in the paper that already looks into this. So thinking from the design world and architecture world, and I think thinking with those practices would be incredibly powerful. Yeah.
Thank you both for those insights. I'm going to go to the chat and pick up on some questions you have already touched upon and sort of answered here. These three questions that we have in the Q&A box. I would say that we have a question about what was not included. We've already talked about that. The bibliography of the paper can be found as part of the paper, but I don't know if there's other resources that you might want to share. And I was kind of struck about this idea of accessibility. Sarah was already talking about one question that came up around issues of gender and care. There's also a question here by Anna Duplessis about accessibility. This was about this gender and care responsibilities. Then Phoebe Liss had a question about what insights have you drawn from assemblies that have taken place outside the more confined spaces, so spaces with physical walls? She asks, were they less successful because citizens were perhaps distracted by the outside environment, or did the atmosphere help ground conversations?
Yes, I know, Felipe, you said in the deliberations that happened in the university, there was moments where deliberations took place outside. Is that the case as well? Or maybe I'm mistaken, but...
Yeah, I think I can say something about the importance of going out to other spaces, not just stay in one room, but also try to go outside and see where the problem is happening. Actually, I was seeing a comment by Joe Matthews in this sense on, for example, public transport on environmental issues or water or urban planning. I think that in all these aspects, it's important, of course, to have a place where you can have the crucial part of the deliberation, but it's also very important to take the people to see the places where things are happening. I would add this.
Thank you.
Maybe I could just jump in.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Just
Sam.
to say around that piece of taking field trips and making sure that all of the assembly members have the experience together of seeing and experiencing the places or the environments that are under consideration in the conversation. And I think that that's an essential component to being able to have successful deliberation. However, those are maybe not the places to actually carry out the deliberation because it's hard to be together. It may be hard to hear. People may be more uncomfortable. So there's an important balance, as in all things, to be found.
This was perhaps what I was trying to touch on with the way of addressing concept stretching through space and thinking with, for example, how can we do deliberations and examples of deliberation that take place on the site visits, on the field trips, and how might they be legitimate forms of communication that should maybe be taken even more seriously in the further process. Um, but that then touches on what do we sort of think proper deliberation should be, or is so this is where I think a further investigation of those other spaces could also be really productive.
I might just say on that the informal conversations that happen in those environments, and while you're getting lunch or going for a quick walk, those do feed into the deliberation. Of course, they're not necessarily formal parts of it, but that relationship building and that exchanging of ideas and perceptions is of course part of what builds the process altogether.
Thanks everybody for those insights. I want to pick up on some of the questions that are here in the chat and the Q&A. Jason Wynn had a question about has any consideration been given to the need for thinking space, which I thought was really interesting point. And then Nadia Nadisan had two questions here. One is, how might deliberative practices look if they were designed to hold discomfort or conflict in terms of thinking about what allows people to more comfortably participate? And that was followed up by, how could comfort be reoriented towards designing for participants who have lived experiences of racism, migration, or precarity? Maybe you have some thoughts on these insights.
We can just comment on that first question around like that kind of thinking space. I think it relates also to what Sarah and Gustav were also just mentioning around the field trips. But one thing I didn't mention from our interview with Anna Edzerson in Brussels is that one of the locations where they hold the assemblies is also located adjacent to a park. And it was very common that assembly members would take their breaks in pairs or in groups or whatever, and that they take a walk around the park to get out of the space, clear their head and that kind of thing. But that, just as Sarah was saying, like that was also really crucial to that sort of trust building as well between the assembly members, and of course informally talking about the topics, but it was also a way for them to get to know each other, build that trust. And there's evidence also to suggest that aspect of like building trust amongst each other creates a sense of cohesion amongst the group too, and it allows them to really then deal with the complexity of the issues that they may be faced with in the deliberations of the assembly itself. So that thinking space of outdoor green space directly adjacent to the assembly can sometimes be really important as well. Gustav, if you want, Barry, go ahead.
Yep. To the second question, it's of course important to think with how we define comfortable spaces and what we think of as comfort. I've thought with a post-colonial geographer called Abdul Malik Simon, who talks about spaces that hold and spaces that are open for improvisational practices, as he calls them. And there's so many ways to think with making spaces for caring, making spaces that can embrace diverse experiences. So I think this is really important work. I know there's also really important work on decolonializing deliberative democracy that also takes place that totally intersects with thinking about the spaces.
Thanks both for this. There was a question also in the chat about the Bridging the Digital Physical Divide by Team Weihrauch. I don't know if you want to add some thoughts on that. And I guess that would be the last question that I would pick up on, because we also need to get to the end of our format today. Any thoughts on the Bridging the Digital Physical Divide?
Yeah, it's definitely something that has come up in our own conversations as well. But yeah, actually, maybe I'll pass it to Felipe there. I see you put your hand up pretty quick, so go for it. Actually, you might have more insights on that.
Actually, was I have some thoughts on the previous question, and it's just a general reflection about. Of course, I am aware of the importance of caring about spaces and so on, but I think that we also need to be aware of some risk of building very artificial spaces. We have to be careful with artificiality. If we want citizens of citizens assemblies to remain in some sense representative of ordinary citizens, then we cannot build like bubbles. Life is tough. Our cities are tough. Politics is sometimes messy also. So in that sense, I think that it's important to keep a balance between spaces where we want to create the best conditions for deliberation, but always remember the conditions in which people live, why they are there. They are there because they are ordinary citizens, and try not to create so very artificial settings. I think that this is important. This is important as well. Always keep some resemblance with reality, and reality, of course, can be tough.
Yeah, I also was going to kind of echo a bit that as well, that this idea that bridging the virtual and the physical. I think there's a part of an assembly process that maybe makes sense to hold online, or it could also be circumstantial, of course, as we saw during COVID, for example. A lot of deliberations that were happening during that time moved online, and there were successful assemblies that came out during that time, of course. And now we see, practitioners sometimes doing, part of the learning phase, hearing from experts online, and then deliberations in person. And that the deliberations, that, the important part of it is not taking place necessarily online, but I think it's still kind of there's this balance that needs to be thought of when deciding throughout an assembly process at what stage we're doing things online versus in person. I guess I'm maybe skeptical, but also interested too in understanding, is there a way to really bridge that, to bring one form into another kind of, but maybe that's something to go into deeper later on as well.
Gustav, do you want to add anything to that?
I had a thought, but I dropped it. I think I've added enough, let's say.
Okay, very well. Well, we do have to come to the end of our time together, as we are almost at the 45 mark. I do want to ask, before Claudia shared the link to the executive summary and to the paper as it is right now in the DemNext website, maybe if we could have that again in the chat. And I just really want to point out that there's been so many interesting resources shared in the chat, so many interesting links. People clicked all of them in your browser, and you're going to go through them afterwards. I want to say thank you to DemNext for the initiative of writing, researching, and publishing this paper. I want to thank James and Gustav for their great presentation today. I want to thank Felipe, Sarah, and Johan for joining us and giving their insights. Thanks to all of you for coming, listening, sharing resources, questions, thoughts. This has been such an enriching discussion. It is, as James and Gustav said, just the beginning, and we don't really need to think small. We can think big. We can think agile, adaptive, big and small, virtual, physical. There's a lot to do. This is just the beginning. And so that's a goodbye from me, and a thank you to all of you for joining us today. I wish you a lovely rest of the day wherever you are, rest of the night wherever you are. And I am sure we'll be hearing about this topic much more soon in the future. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Vera.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vera, and
Thank
everyone.
you.
All right.
Congratulations.
Thank you all.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, everyone. Bye.